Today we are going to talk a little bit about anger. And there's a reason that my topic is anger. It's not something that any one of you did or anything like that. Although I could make up some stories, but no. So I actually used part of this material during the Awaken Youth Conference we just had a couple weeks ago with the teens. And part of it's mine, just as full disclosure, and part of it is not. Some of this is from a guy named Jonathan McKee, who is he's a youth guy mostly. He's an author, he's a speaker, does a bunch of different youth stuff. And he also has a really good website for youth leaders and parents as well, that's all free. All the materials on there that is free, so used some of his stuff in the past before, but pulled some of it for Awaken, and wanted to talk to the kids about anger and how we control it. And the reason I got thinking about it initially was a couple of different instances that I'd seen on the news, social media, that kind of thing, that had really just got me thinking about how when we get angry, you could go from you're okay to really angry in a split second and make a decision that would change your life forever instantly, right? So that's kind of what got me thinking about it. The first story was Knoebels. I don't know if you're aware, but there was a stabbing at Knoebels a few weeks ago, earlier this summer. I saw that and my brain went, it's Knoebels. Like, it's Knoebels. Why are we stabbing people at Knoebels? Why are we stabbing people ever? But why are we stabbing people at Knoebels? You think of it's free entry, you have the good food, you got the rides, the water rides, right? The campground, everything. Knoebels. There was a stabbing at Knoebels. Two ladies got into it over, one of them was going to leave, basically, is what it came down to, in short. And that was going to leave the other lady without a ride, I believe is how it was. They were camping together. They knew each other. It wasn't strangers. And the other sliced her in the throat with a knife. Right? Okay, from what I understand. Nobody died or whatever. But still, Knoebels, a stabbing. Really? And then the second story I saw, and some of you may have seen this if you have social media, there is a TikTok going around, and I guess I saw it on Facebook because I don't have TikTok, but of a guy that's pulling a camper, and he gets out of his truck and comes running around, and he just starts wailing on this other vehicle's window. Probably hits it like 10 or 12 times. Doesn't break the window, but I can only imagine how bad his fist probably hurt the next day. But he's wailing on this window, and you see his wife kind of come running out and like nudge in between him and the window and stop him from going any farther, right? Now the first story, somebody's going to jail, right? The stabbing. Second story, probably no like life-altering things happened from him punching the window. But at the same time, I think, all right, if I get mad on the road, how mad would I have to be to get out of my vehicle and like punch somebody's window? I can get mad, but ooh, I don't know about that. So that was all that, and a bunch of other stuff was kind of what got me thinking on this topic, and then I got poking around and found some of this material from Jonathan McKee there. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about anger. It's a reality, right? We all have it. The question then becomes, all right, if we all have anger, how do we control it? So we actually see in the Bible a couple different instances of God and anger, right? Psalm 7:11 says that God is angry with the wicked every day. Mark 3:5 says, Jesus looked around at them with anger. And 1 Samuel 11:6 says, the Spirit of God came upon Saul and he became angry. So obviously, if we make the correlation, if God can be angry, then we've got to make this next step that means anger isn't necessarily wrong, right? Because if anger is a sin and God is angry, then God's not perfect, and that causes many, many theological issues that we're not going to go down, right? So if God can be angry, then anger isn't necessarily a sin. Now for us as humans, God built into us the ability to have a emotional response, right? And that's what anger basically is. It's an emotional response. So that leaves us with the idea then that our response to anger must be what is important. How should we respond? Now, if you look at social media, if you watch movies, whatever, all the things, we are kind of taught from early in our life that if somebody makes you angry, if somebody makes you mad, you go Hulk on them, right? You kick their butt. Best move? Yeah, probably not. Ephesians 4:26 and 27 says that when you're angry, do not sin. Stop being angry before the end of the day. Don't give the devil a foothold. So the question then, as I said earlier, is how do we take this emotion that we have and respond well to it? How do we not give the devil a foothold? How can we control our feelings of anger? Now, can you pull out a self-help book or go to an anger management course? Yeah, absolutely, right? There might be some value there for any one of us. But what we want to look at today is that there's much more than just that we can do. And so kind of our main idea for today is that when I'm tempted to lose control, do I need to have self-control? Absolutely. But it's a whole lot more than that. It's me giving God control at the same time. So we are going to look at the book of Nehemiah chapter 5 today. And we're going to see that Nehemiah kind of fits exactly that. He gets angry for a good reason at that, and responds in a good way then as well, where the end result's positive. So we're going to read Nehemiah 5, 1 through 13. It says, "Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their Jewish brothers. Some were saying, 'We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain.' Others were saying, 'We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine.' Still others were saying, 'We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our countrymen, and though our sons are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to them.' When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, 'You are exacting usury from your own countrymen.' So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, 'As far as possible, we have bought back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your brothers only for them to be sold back to us.' They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, 'What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain, but let the exacting of usury stop. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the usury you are charging them, the 100th part of the money, grain, new wine, and oil.' 'We will give it back,' they said, 'and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say.' Then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, 'In this way may God shake out of his house and possessions every man who does not keep his promise. So may such a man be shaken out and emptied.' At this, the whole assembly said, 'Amen,' and praised the Lord, and the people did as they had promised." So just a little backstory to where we're at here in Nehemiah. So about a century before, the Jewish people had been conquered by Babylon, and the city was destroyed, the walls, the temple, everything was destroyed, and the people were like scattered out, right? Obviously that was devastating to them. Half a century before this, though, Cyrus, the king of Persia, conquered Babylon, and he thought that it was a better political move to let the people go back to where they were originally from and kind of control them from there. He was right. It was a good idea. So this is where we're at. The Jews had returned to Jerusalem. They'd rebuilt the temple, and earlier in the book of Nehemiah is where we see them rebuilding the walls, right? Now, did rebuilding the walls go smoothly? Not totally, right? They had issues of local people causing trouble with them, poking fun at God's people because of their beliefs, threatening harm, right? And Nehemiah, in his wisdom, ends up dividing the workers into two groups. One group's working on the wall, sword at their side, and the other group is standing guard so nothing can happen, right? In addition to all that, though, times were tough, right? So many people had come back to Jerusalem in such a short period of time that the population explosion caused famine to happen as well. So now they're also hungry and barely scraping by, in addition to everything else that's going on. So it's tough times, right? But they pressed on. And then we kind of get to where we're at right here in chapter 5. They get attacked, not from somebody outside, not from an outside enemy, but they get attacked from their own people. And that made Nehemiah angry, right? Doesn't really seem to be a guy who got angry really easily and went off the roof real quick. But in this instance, he saw his own people stabbing their brothers in the back, and it ticked him off. So today we want to look at this example of Nehemiah, who might have been tempted to lose control, but he ends up giving God the control, and we have a positive result. So we're going to look at 3 things that Nehemiah did when he was angry. And I probably don't need to say this, but I'm going to say it anyways. Obviously, when you're angry, there's a whole lot more you can do than just 3 things, right? But we want to look at 3 specific things that we can see here in Nehemiah 5 and apply them to our life. So, number 1. The first thing that Nehemiah did when he was angry was he admitted it. He flat out says in verse 6, when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. All right, so step 1, he admits he's angry. He didn't hide it. He just flat out tells us. Also seems he didn't try to just shove it down and repress it, right? He acknowledged the fact that he was mad, and that's probably a lot of times where we need to start as individuals. It's really easy when something goes wrong, you're angry about something, you're upset about something, to just kind of shove it all down inside of you. And that seems fine. Only problem is that someday it's coming out, and it is going to be ugly. We've probably all done that ourselves or experienced somebody else doing that type of thing, and it's never pretty, is it? It's never good. As I told you before, part of this material was Jonathan McKee's. He had an illustration in here that I really liked. It was really good, and so I kept it. So I'm going to read you what he wrote, and every time I say I, it's not me, just so you know. There's a couple hints in there that you'll figure that out pretty quickly. But so Jonathan says, I remember a morning years ago when I was making my kids some waffles. I was bummed to find only a little bit of syrup, but it seemed enough for us to have to share on our waffles. So I popped it in the microwave as always, because who doesn't like warm syrup? Knowing that it was empty, I only punched in 30 seconds because that would be plenty of time for such a small amount of syrup in that little plastic container. Only problem, I didn't press 30 seconds. My finger must have been a little strong on the 0 because I punched it twice. So now we're at 5 minutes. Slight difference. After about 2 minutes, a small voice in the back of my head said, hey, Jonathan, don't you think that syrup should have been done long ago? So I listened to that little voice and looked at the microwave. I first realized my mistake when I saw that I had 45 seconds remaining from my original 30 seconds. The math doesn't work. Secondly, when I saw the small plastic syrup container now bloated to the size of a gallon of milk. Panicking, I opened the microwave and quickly pulled the swollen container out. Before I could even think of what to do with this swollen, pressurized container with boiling syrup in it, it exploded everywhere. All over the kitchen, right? Good news, only had small burns on his body, little ones, little specks of syrup. Bad news is that he then spent the next several hours cleaning up syrup from everything, right? The ceiling, the walls, the refrigerator, everything. Syrup everywhere. And he doesn't say this, but I also figure if the syrup's all over, did they then have dry waffles? Or what did they do? Just butter? No waffles? I don't know. But that picture there of the syrup just blowing up and then blam, exploding, right, is a really good picture, I think, of what happens when people try to hold their anger in. It just ends up eventually boiling over and exploding. Right. And oftentimes in those situations, we end up doing things that probably really would have never done before. Things that are not like us normal. We may feel like, I got this, I can handle it, right? When we're angry or whenever a bad situation's going on, I can control it, I'm handling it just fine. But the reality is we don't really got it. And that's kind of the point, is that we need Jesus desperately. And when I try to do things on my own, I'm much more likely to fail. Let's see, who's Danielle and Becker in here? Melanie and Gabby. You guys have probably all heard me say this before. I've told the youth kids this more than once, but I honestly, generally, got this, right, in life. I feel like I can handle most things, right? I can do my job, I can take care of situations, I can make a living, like all the things, right? I can do it. But that's not really good. Can I do it? Yeah, most of the time, maybe. But when I allow Jesus to be in control of me, all the things that I got, that I have, totally change, right? It might be similar, but everything is much better. I'm happier. Situations are handled better. Just everything down the line. Right. And that's kind of the basics of Christianity. It's admitting that we need help, that we can't do it on our own. We need Jesus. We need God, right? The problem, though, with anger is that a lot of times we don't stop long enough when we're angry to let God then control what we've got going on, right? So that's where step 2 leads into. So step 1 is admit you're angry. And step 2 is to stop and think, to take a pause, right? In verse 7 there in Nehemiah 5, Nehemiah says, after thinking it through, or depending on your translation, I pondered them in my mind. Bottom line is, he got angry, and then he stopped, right? He didn't just go from there. He stopped and thought. And we actually see the same thing in chapter 1 when it came to the rebuilding of the walls. When Hananiah tells him the bad news of the walls being in ruin, he weeps, he fasts, he prays, and then it seems, if you read in there, it wasn't until about 4 months later that he actually acted on all of that and approached the king and made a plan, right? So he took time to think over it, to pray over it, to make a plan, and then he approached the king. Now, is stop and think a good anger management tip? Yeah, right? But we're going to take it one step farther versus just to stop, get yourself out of the situation, whatever it might be. Should you do that? Yup. But in this case, when we say stop and think, we want to think about the idea of when I stop, when I pause, when I step back from the situation, I then take a minute to pray and to ask God for his help here, with the realization that if I respond right here, probably not going to be the best. God, how do you want me to respond instead? You know, maybe take the time to pray, maybe take the time to talk through it with some godly friends for their wisdom. Whatever you do, it's not just saying, yep, I got this, and going with the first thing out of your head, right? That's tricky, right? You might be thinking, okay, I'm really angry. Think of the angriest you've ever been, whatever that is. If I was in youth group, I'd say I don't need to hear about it. But think of the angriest you've ever been, and picture yourself stopping in the middle of that and doing this. Probably not the easiest thing ever, right? However, I've got another situation to throw at you where you've probably done exactly that. So think of when you've been really angry. You're on the phone with somebody angry. You're in your house yelling at somebody in the car, whatever. You're really going at it. You're really angry, and your phone rings. All right? You keep going at it. Your phone rings again. You keep going at it, and then finally, you pick up your phone. Hello, this is Steve. Oh, hey, Bob. Yep, I'll be at youth group on Wednesday. I'll bring that then. Yep. All right, we'll see you then. Thank you. Right back at it, right? Probably done that, right? So maybe that idea of stopping is there. Maybe we can do that, right? I don't know, right? We can control it to an extent. I think a lot of times in the privacy of our own car or our house or wherever we might be, you're like, I'm at my house. I'm where I'm comfortable. I don't need to control it. But sometimes you just need to step back from the situation, go for a walk, shoot some baskets, whatever it might be. Get some distance between you and the situation. Come down from it just a little bit, and when you come down from it, you've got a better ability to stop and pray and ask God for help from there. So, step 1, admit you're angry. Step 2, like Nehemiah did, he stopped, he thought it over. We asked God for help and how he would like us to respond. Number 3, step 3. The last principle is also in these verses 7 through 9. After all of that, and I don't know how long that took, but after all that, Nehemiah calls a meeting together and communicates a well-thought-out proposal. He doesn't just blurt out the first thing that comes to mind, which is what we all like to do when we're arguing, right? You're arguing, but you're typically thinking ahead of what you're going to say next. You know, the listening thing, usually not so good. So he doesn't just fly off the handle. He thinks it over, then he acts rationally and thoughtfully in verses 7 through 9. He makes 3 accusations. The first thing in verse 7, he says, you're charging interest to your brothers, the fellow Jews, and that was wrong. Now, if you look in the Jewish law, that you could see that not only was it that against the Jewish law, but it was the way they were doing it, how much they were doing it was also harsh. He then goes on to say, and he's making things even worse here, number 2, he says, you're putting your brothers into permanent slavery in verse 8. Also wrong. Leviticus 25 talks specifically about that and how if you as a Jew had a Jewish slave or servant, after a certain number of years, they had to get released into freedom again, and they weren't doing that. And then number 3, he doesn't just leave it at that. He also says, everybody, other nations around you, see everything that's going on. They're watching you. In other words, you're not being a good example for God, not at all. And that also applies to us really easily, I think. Philippians 1:27 and 28, Paul says, whatever happens, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, contending as one man for the faith of the gospel without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God. And then Peter goes on to say in 1 Peter 2:11 and 12, the same idea about how our conduct can affect those around us that don't already follow Jesus. He says, dear friends, I urge you, as aliens and strangers in the world, to abstain from sinful desires which wage against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So Nehemiah thinks it over, and then he makes these charges to the Jews. And if you read those verses there, it must have been pretty well presented, because verse 8 says they kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. They knew they were wrong, right? And thankfully, Nehemiah handled himself here in a way that ends up with a situation having a clear effect on others. If he had just gone off the rails, very well might not have had the same ending, right? So Nehemiah is that example that we can still learn from today. So as we work towards wrapping up here, the reality is that we have a couple of options, right? Which we do with everything in life. We have options for everything. When you leave here today, you have options for lunch, right? When I get up tomorrow morning, I have the option of getting up when my alarm goes off and going to work, or staying in bed longer, which is really what I'd like to do, because 4:30 is really early. I have the option of putting gas in my Jeep, or not. See what happens. I have the option of treating people well, or not, right? We have options for everything. Well, anger is the same thing. We have options. The first one is just to let your anger explode, kind of like the 2 stories we talked about earlier. I picked out a third one to tell as well. And these examples might seem extreme. They might seem like something you would never do, and hopefully that's the case. But I think they illustrate well how quickly we can go from I'm good to I'm not good, and it's bad, right? So this is also another road rage story, and if you Google road rage stories in like the last, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years, there's some crazy, like insane ones out there. So anyways, 2 guys driving down the road, they get into it. I don't know what happened, but they get into it on the road, right? Not only do they get into it, but they get into it so bad that they actually each pull guns out and shoot into the other vehicle, right? So now think about yourself driving down the road. Somebody makes you mad on the road, they cut you off, whatever. You might get angry, but then that's kind of like it, right? Well, they got angry enough that they each pulled out guns, right? That's a whole nother level there. Well, there's a whole nother level. They got into a road rage situation with each having kids in the car, both of them. Then they both pulled out guns, and then they both shot into the other vehicle, and they both hit the other's daughter, all right? So they probably weren't great shots, although driving a vehicle and shooting at the same time is probably not very easy. But nonetheless, they each shot the other dad's daughter. Now they're okay. This one was earlier this year, I believe, if I remember right. But both of those families' lives changed forever in that split-second decision, right? They probably didn't get in their cars and drive down the road that day thinking, yeah, I'm going to get into it with somebody. I'm going to shoot somebody. No, right? They got into it, and their anger went, and then, boom, it just exploded, right? And that's kind of where we're at every day, right? We could easily, if we're not careful, make that jump and change my life forever, change one of your lives forever, right? Because the reality is, everything that I do doesn't just affect me, right? Everything that I do affects other people. And we see that very well in this story where the two guys each shoot each other's daughter, right? Somebody's going to jail, or both, most likely, and both their kids got shot, right? Life's changed forever in a split-second decision that didn't end well. So that's kind of our first option, is to just let your anger build, and then explode. Or we can look at this example that we saw here in Nehemiah today, who admitted he was angry, he stopped, he paused, and then he made a well-thought-out decision. He didn't lose control, he didn't just apply self-control, but he took the time to give God control. So it kind of comes down to two things. What end result do you want? And who's controlling your life? Are you, or are you letting God control your life? So when we look at Nehemiah here, we can see exactly that. And so next time we or I am tempted to lose control, maybe we can think about, okay, I'm going to lose it right here. If I try to control it, it might be controlled. But if I let God control the situation right here, if I step back and give him control, things are going to end better. Things will have a good, positive end result. And my life might be changed, but in this situation, it'll be changed for the better.